1 hour before every sermon, Jim Jones locked the door. Not the door to the sanctuary, not the door to the stage, the door to the small room behind the stage where he spent the hour before he became Jim Jones in front of a crowd. The people who saw what happened in that room in the early years, the 1960s, the Indianapolis years, before the move to California, before Jonestown, before everything, described it one way. The people who saw what happened in that room in the final years, the Guyana years, the years when the pharmaceutical assistants had become indistinguishable from the man himself, described it an entirely different way. And the distance between those two descriptions is not just the story of Jim Jones. It is the story of how a person becomes what Jim Jones became. Not all at once. Not through a single decision. But through 1,000 small substitutions, each one invisible on its own, each one building on the last, until the man who walked through the door an hour later and stood at the microphone and made thousands of people feel seen and saved and certain of something, until that man had almost nothing left in common with the man who had first locked that door 30 years before. If you have ever looked at someone like Jim Jones and asked not just what he did but how he became capable of doing it, subscribe right now and hit the bell. Because that question is the only one this channel exists to answer. The monster at the end of the story is never where the story begins. Go back to the beginning. Go back to Indianapolis, Indiana, in the middle 1950s, when Jim Jones was in his mid-20s and People's Temple was not yet called People's Temple and the room behind the stage was a small office in a rented church hall that smelled like old carpet and institutional cleaning fluid. Jones had been preaching since his teenage years. He had the gift, everyone who knew him then agrees on that, even the people who later came to despise everything he stood for. The gift was real. It was not manufactured or performed or learned from a book. When Jones stood in front of a crowd and spoke, something happened in the room. People leaned forward. People felt addressed personally, felt that the words were finding something in them specifically that no one else had found. People wept. People laughed. People gave money they could not afford to give and felt, afterward, not cheated but grateful. In those early years, the hour before the sermon was preparation in the most ordinary sense. Jones reviewed his notes. He prayed or did something that looked like prayer, a private conversation with whatever he believed in at that point, which was genuinely unclear even to people close to him. He was abstemious. He did not drink before services. He did not take anything. He paced. He was nervous in the way that performers are nervous before going on. Not afraid, but alert, the nervous system doing its job of sharpening the instrument before it was needed. People who worked with him in those years describe a man who was difficult and demanding and occasionally frightening in his intensity, but who was also, in that hour before the service, recognizably human. Recognizably a person under pressure doing something that mattered to him. The first substitution happened sometime in the early 1960s. Jones had been diagnosed with what his physicians described as extreme fatigue and what the people around him described more plainly as the consequences of a man who slept 4 hours a night, traveled constantly, ran an organization with hundreds of members, preached multiple services a week, and refused to acknowledge any physical limitation whatsoever. A doctor prescribed amphetamines. This was not unusual in the early 1960s. Amphetamines were prescribed routinely for fatigue, for weight management, for depression, for the general demands of high-functioning professional life. Jones took them. They worked. The exhaustion receded. The sharpness returned. The hour before the sermon became easier. What no one around Jones understood at the time, what Jones himself may not have understood, is that the hour before the sermon had just changed in a way that would not be reversible. Not immediately. Not obviously. But permanently. Because what the amphetamines were doing was not restoring the energy Jones had before. They were producing a different energy. A sharper energy, a more focused energy, an energy that had a particular quality of certainty and invulnerability that the old nervous, pacing, genuinely uncertain of himself Jones had never quite possessed. And when Jones walked through the door after that first medicated hour and stood at the microphone, the congregation felt the difference. They called it anointing. They called it the Spirit moving. They said he was more powerful than ever, more direct, more certain, more present. They were right about all of that. They were wrong about the source. By the mid-1960s, the amphetamines were joined by other things. Sedatives for the crash that followed the stimulants. Painkillers for the headaches that followed the sedatives. The pharmacological ecosystem of a man who was managing, with increasing chemical assistance, the gap between what his body could actually do and what his schedule required of it. The people closest to him, his inner circle, the small group of senior members who traveled with him and managed his affairs, knew about the medications. They did not discuss them outside the inner circle. The congregation did not know. And Jones, in the hour before each service, was spending less time in preparation and more time in management. Management of the chemical balance that would allow him to walk through the door and be, for the next 2 or 3 hours, the version of himself the congregation needed him to be. Here is the thing that the people who were there in both eras, the early years and the later years, always say when they describe the difference. They say the performance was identical. The voice was the same. The eye contact was the same. The ability to read a room, to find the person who needed to be called forward, to say the thing that landed in the precise center of someone's private pain, all of it was the same. From the outside, from the congregation's perspective, nothing had changed. The man at the microphone was the same man. But from the inside. From the perspective of the handful of people who had known Jones in both eras and who saw him in that room in the hour before, something fundamental had shifted. In the early years, the preparation had been about getting Jones ready to meet the congregation. In the later years, the preparation was about getting Jones ready to perform the congregation. The distinction sounds subtle. It was not subtle at all. By the time People's Temple relocated to San Francisco in the early 1970s, the hour before the sermon had become something that Jones protected with a ferocity that made even senior members nervous. Access to that room was restricted to 2 or 3 people. What happened in it was understood to be private in a way that nothing else about Jones's life was private. His relationships, his theology, his politics, his finances were all, to varying degrees, communal property. But that hour, and that room, belonged to Jones alone. When members asked about it, as some occasionally did, especially newer members who hadn't yet learned which questions not to ask, they were told that Jones needed solitude to prepare spiritually. This was true in the same way that many things about People's Temple were true, accurate in its surface description, misleading in everything it implied. The senior member who spent the most time in proximity to Jones's pre-sermon preparation across the full span of his career was a man who served as his personal assistant for nearly 15 years, from the mid-1960s through the early years in Guyana. This man, who spoke to journalists in the years after Jonestown under conditions of anonymity, his identity protected in every account that has been published, described the transition in terms that are so precise and so specific that they have the quality of something that has been rehearsed, not because they are fabricated but because they have been gone over many times in private, in the way that you go over things that you are trying to understand. He said, in the early years, I would knock and he would open the door and I could see he had been pacing. The room would be warm from his movement. He would be slightly damp. His notes would be out. He would look like a man who had been working, physically working, on something difficult. And then he would straighten up and take a breath and walk through the door and become himself. Become the version of himself that the people needed. He said, in the later years, I would knock and there would be a pause before he opened the door. The pause got longer over time. When he opened it, the room was different. Quieter. He was sitting, not pacing. The notes were sometimes out and sometimes not. He would look at me and I could always tell whether the balance was right. Whether the combination that particular evening had landed correctly. If it had, he was extraordinary. More focused than anyone I have ever seen. More present. More certain. If it hadn't, if the balance was slightly off, if he had misjudged the timing or the dose, he was something else. Something I do not have a clean word for. Still functional. Still capable of walking through the door and preaching a service. But there was something missing from behind the eyes. Something that had been there in the early years that was no longer reliably there. He was asked, what was missing? He said, him. That answer has appeared in several accounts and is always quoted without further elaboration because the journalist who first recorded it understood, correctly, that elaborating would diminish it. Him. The thing that was missing, in the later years, in the hour before the sermon, in the room where Jim Jones spent the final minutes before becoming Jim Jones for another crowd, was Jim Jones. The instrument had outlasted the musician. The performance continued. The congregation felt nothing different. 900 people rose to their feet when he walked through the door. They wept and they gave and they believed. And behind the dark glasses, in the place where the certainty and the presence and the gravitational pull were all still functioning perfectly, there was a vacancy that had been growing for years and that only the people who had known both versions could recognize. This is the part of the Jim Jones story that is hardest to hold. Not the massacre. Not the manipulation. But this. That the charisma was real, and it continued to work, long after the person generating it had been replaced by a chemical approximation of that person. That 918 people followed a ghost. That the ghost was convincing enough that even people who had known the original could not always tell the difference. That the congregation never had access to the room behind the stage, never saw the hour before the performance, never saw the pause before the door opened or the quality of the silence inside or the eyes that looked out from behind the dark glasses and were, increasingly and then finally and then irreversibly, the eyes of a man who was no longer entirely present in his own life. There is one more detail from that room. In the last months before Jonestown. The final months in San Francisco, the months when the move to Guyana was being planned and the legal pressure was building and Jones's behavior in public was becoming erratic enough that even loyal members were beginning to register the change, the assistant who had spent 15 years in proximity to that preparation noticed something new. Jones had begun, in the final minutes before opening the door, to stand in front of the small mirror that hung on the wall of the room and to look at himself. Not to check his appearance. Not to adjust his clothing or his hair. Just to look. The assistant observed this through the door on 2 occasions when it was slightly ajar. Both times Jones stood in front of the mirror for what felt like a long time, the assistant estimated a minute, perhaps 2. With an expression that the assistant described, in every account, with the same word. He said Jones looked puzzled. As if he was looking at someone he recognized but could not quite place. As if the face in the mirror was familiar in the way that a face can be familiar when you have seen it many times but have never been formally introduced. The assistant said, I think he was trying to remember something. I don't know what. Maybe who he had been before he became what he was. Maybe just the feeling of being a person who was actually there, actually present, actually inhabiting his own life. I don't know. He never said. And I never asked. Because by that point, there were many things neither of us said. That was how it worked, by the end. The silence had become its own kind of preparation. Jones walked through the door. The congregation rose. The performance was flawless. And in the small room behind the stage, the mirror held the reflection of no one for a few seconds before the assistant closed the door, and the last hour before the last version of Jim Jones disappeared into the noise and the certainty and the 900 voices that still, even then, rose to meet him. There is a question that nobody who studies Jim Jones ever fully answers. The question is, at what point did Jones know? At what point did he understand that what he was doing in that room had become irreversible? That the substitution was complete? That the instrument was running on something other than the musician? The people who knew him best give answers that are all slightly different and all probably partially correct. Some say he never knew that the pharmaceutical management had become so complete that the self-awareness required to know had itself been managed away. Some say he knew from the beginning that the first substitution was chosen, that a man who understood power as well as Jones did would have accepted the trade immediately. Some say he knew at the end that the mirror in the final months was the evidence that a man who stands in front of his own reflection looking puzzled has arrived, too late, at the answer to a question he had been avoiding for years. None of these answers is provable. The room is gone. The mirror is gone. The man who stood in front of it is gone, dead on the floor of the pavilion on November 18, 1978, surrounded by 918 people who had never been allowed into that room, who had never seen the pause before the door opened, who had never asked the question the assistant never asked. They knew the performance. They did not know the performer. And the performer, in the end, may not have known himself. What Jones understood. From the very beginning, before the medications, before the substitution, was that the congregation did not need the man. They needed what the man produced. The feeling of being seen. The certainty. The belonging. Jones knew how to produce that feeling because he had felt it himself, once, before he became the one producing it for others. And at some point, the assistant with 15 years of proximity puts it sometime in the late 1960s. He made the calculation that the feeling mattered more than who was producing it. That the performance was the point and the performer was secondary. This is the calculation that separates a leader from what Jones became. Not cruelty. Not grandiosity. Just this, the decision that the performance is the point. That the private self, the pacing, uncertain, genuinely struggling self, is a problem to be managed rather than a person to be preserved. Jones managed it. He managed it for 30 years, with increasing chemical assistance, in a room that fewer and fewer people were allowed near. He managed it so completely that even the people who saw him in that room, in those final years, in the minutes before he became himself for another crowd, could not always tell what was performance and what was person. Could not always locate the line between the instrument and the musician. Could not always answer the question the assistant was eventually asked, directly, by a journalist in the years after Jonestown: "Did you ever feel, in all those years, that you were watching a real person?" The assistant was quiet for a long time before he answered. Then he said, "In the beginning, yes. In the beginning he was the most real person I had ever been near. The most present. The most alive to what was happening in a room. I have never been near anyone since who had that quality." And then, over years, it changed. Not all at once. Gradually. And the terrible thing, the thing I have spent a long time trying to understand, is that the performance got better as the person got less. As if the disappearance of the man was somehow refining the instrument. As if what made him extraordinary was being distilled as everything else was stripped away. By the end he was the purest version of the performance I had ever seen. And there was almost nothing of him left inside it. He paused. Then he said, "I think that is what he chose. I think he knew, at some level, that he was making that trade. And I think he genuinely believed, right up until the end, that it was worth it. That what he was giving people was worth what it cost him. I think he was wrong. But I think he believed it. The door to that room no longer exists. The building was demolished years after Jonestown. The building was torn down years ago. The mirror is gone. The notes, on the nights when there were notes, are gone. What remains is the testimony of a small number of people who were allowed near enough to see, and the recordings of the services that followed the hour behind the door, and the 44-minute tape that documents where all of it ended. The performance ran for 30 years. It was, by the measure of what it produced in the people who experienced it, extraordinary. It cost one man everything he was. It cost 918 people everything they had. And it began, every single time, with a door closing, and an hour alone, and a man standing in front of a mirror trying to remember something he had decided, a long time ago, he could afford to lose.